Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are, I wouldn't say excited might be the right word, but we are grateful to have a space where we can talk about a conversation that's coming up with far too many organizations that are giving us a call these days, which is responding to revenue disruption. So, this framework that we've developed has come out of many conversations that we've had over the last several years, as well as just our history of experience working with organizations that are facing disruption to their different revenue streams. And so I'm really excited to be, here with you today with Annie Rashek, our principal. And as we go through this conversation, we really invite you to use the chat for questions and comments throughout the presentation. And at the end of the session, we are going to stop the recording so that we can really have a more confidential, open space for folks to be able to ask specific questions or get some, feedback and support on challenges that they're facing within their organizations. Everyone who registered for the session will get the recording of the session, the slides, as well as the resources. So you can look forward to having those later. So for those of you who are with us live in person today, we invite you to introduce yourselves to each other in the chat. And as I said, we'll have a space at the end of the session for you to be able to also connect with each other as well.
And I always will encourage folks as you connect and introduce each other in the chat to connect with each other on LinkedIn. I think this is also just a great way to meet people and other nonprofit leaders that might be facing similar challenges. So great to kind of build a peer group around these issues. So Andy Rashek, principal at FIO Partners, very happy to be here with my colleague Melissa Harris. But for those of you that might be less familiar with FIO, we are a national social sector consulting firm with headquarters in Connecticut. And our primary work is around supporting leaders to make better decisions. FIO is Latin for become, and we partner with the organizations that we work with to become the organizations that they envision. We only work in the social sector with nonprofits, foundations, collaboratives, government agencies, and of course, boards of directors. And our services are really around choice making. So strategic planning, strategic alliances, which is really that continuum of potential partnership in the nonprofit sector, leadership advisory support. We've recently added search, but just about 2 years ago. And again, search and transition. We also focus on research and evaluation. And we lately have been doing actually a substantive amount of work around culture and climate in a post-COVID hybrid work space with many of our clients. So just really happy for those of you who have plugged in either via the recording or live today to get to know FIO and our work a little bit. And so welcome. And so with that, I want to set some framing for today's discussion. As we have been doing work over the last couple of years, we really do need to acknowledge the amount of disruption in the sector over the last, in some cases, 24 months. But if we look back even farther, certainly COVID presented its own set of disruptions to the work that we do in communities. But due to, in so many ways, shifts at the federal level in terms of policy, over this last few years, we have really seen funder realignment, economic volatility, and a recognition that organizations are being faced with moments that were unexpected, shifts in funder priorities, shifts in leadership priorities, really in so many ways being asked to make decisions quickly. And this idea of reacting to a volatile environment is something that we've really seen our clients and nonprofit leaders facing over the last 18 months to 2 years. And what we've recognized is that your ability to, in so many ways, react to a fast changing environment really has to do a lot with your own clarity around your own work and some of the options that are available to you. And we want to recognize that whether it's anxiety, paralysis, not being sure how to proceed, confusion, that in so many ways shared leadership in the sector, this is really CEOs and boards coming together to recognize that the sector is not what it was, and the things that we thought we could count on, we can't. And so that really means in a lot of ways, and as we've been talking about supporting our clients, working with philanthropy to support grantees, what does this really moment mean for leadership and leadership decision making? And in a lot of ways, we as a team have been saying, how do we help leaders sort of frame this moment, regardless in some ways of where you are in the sense of your own organizational health and stability, and begin to sort of take a proactive stance and chart their own destiny in this kind of moment of confusion confusion and disruption. And so we've worked internally to really begin to develop a framework that really what we hope supports good decision and doesn't actually prescribe just a single solution. This is all about considering your process of decision making as to how your organizations proceed in these difficult moments. Pass it back to Melissa to kick us off about what we're going to hope to do today.
Absolutely. Well, and that last observation that you made, Anne, is so important because the way we're going to go through the content today, you'll see that there are confluences of different contexts, situations that really come together to make unique decisions for each organization. So, as Anne said, there's not one single solution that organizations can look to kind of answer their questions. It's really being able to assess your organization's position, frame those really challenging conversations that you need to have with each other as a board and staff leadership team, and together really start to develop a clearer view of the range of strategic responses that you could potentially take as an organization, and then very deliberately choosing, one of those paths to take. So, what would be really helpful just to start, if we just would love to get a sense for which of these following statements feels closest to your organization's current reality. So, in the chat, you can pop, from 1 to 5, your answer to this little quick pulse poll. So, 1, we're in good shape and we want to be proactive about ensuring we have a solid business model. 2, we've experienced some revenue disruption, but we can weather the storm and really are just looking to strengthen our sustainability. 3, we've experienced some revenue disruption and it hurts because we don't have as much financial cushion or flexibility. 4, we've experienced moderate to major revenue disruption and need to develop an immediate course of action while considering our long-term sustainability. 5, we've experienced moderate to major revenue disruption and aren't sure if we could make it. And we have talked to organizations at every single one of these points. So no judgment. It just really helps to see where folks are kind of on this continuum here. And I know we also do have some consultants on the call. So if you want to put 6,
Just curious.
I am somebody who is helping who is helping organizations facing these conditions. Feel free to add that as well. But it just would be helpful to kind of know where folks are on this range of current realities.
Great.
All right.
So let's dive into the model and do kind of an overview. Melissa, do you want to help me take this one?
Sure.
Yeah.
So as we are, looking at this framework overall, there's really like 2 major steps that come into place for it. First is assessing your position. And we ask 2 major questions under that. What's the financial reality? And then also, what do we have to work with? I think it's important that as we're doing this assessment, we're looking at current conditions that are both challenging as well as positions of strength. And we'll get into those a little bit more later. And then with that information, that assessment in hand, you're really able then to sit and decide how to respond. And again, there's no one right solution, but it's thinking about your different contexts and your core commitments, looking at your overall kind of strength of position, and then deciding whether you're looking to take more proactive strategic responses, protective ones, or considering some responsible restructuring.
And one of the things, Melissa, I think that's really important for folks to see in this framework. I think core to FEO partners' work around leadership decision is recognizing the complexity of shared decision
Mm-hmm.
making in what may be perceived as a time of crisis. And so what we want to try to do is as we walk through the various components of their framework is recognize that decision making in the social sector is complex because it recognizes that the board of directors has a role to play in decision making in partnership with a CEO, executive director, or senior management team. And size, scope, and scale of an entity
Mm-hmm.
matters in terms of how this decision making has worked out historically. What are the practices of decision making in place today? And so as we go through the framework, what we want to try to have you think about is how do I set the decision making table? What are the steps in that process? What's the information that we can bring to bear to help everyone participate in that decision making from a place of knowledge and confidence as an individual player in that decision making ecosystem? And what are some of the questions and prompts that we would encourage you to explore in that shared decision making group?
Absolutely. And when you look at the information that, we're going to be talking about today, the financial reality is just one component. So like you're saying, Anne, there's intersecting things to consider here, and financial data will inform the choices, but leadership judgment really is going to shape the outcomes of the decisions that are being made here. So,
Absolutely. And set the path forward. And I think that's
mhm,
what I think we want to try to find a balance for in today's conversation, which is the importance of information, but having that information shared with decision makers is almost even more important. So,
mhm,
Melissa, why don't we take a look and a start at that financial reality piece? And so, one of the things that we've been seeing with some of our clients is limited visibility around financial position in some cases until it's too late. And so the
mhm,
first place that we want to encourage learning and assessment is to really work together as a board and staff to better understand the current financial reality of the organization. Many organizations might be looking at just a standard monthly P&L, maybe compared to the prior month, maybe compared to the prior year. Very few organizations that we work with are actually doing forecasting, cash flow forecasting. And so, what we want to try to do is first level set all of the players around what do things look like today. So, taking a look at things like recent current revenue position, projected net operating budget, whether that's a surplus, a break even, or a deficit, really looking across the incoming revenue in terms of likelihood, really actually potentially going grant by grant, saying, well, we got this last
mhm,
year, are we going to get it next year? What's the likelihood that this will happen? Beginning to think about some financial potential scenario planning, like if that grant doesn't come through, what could offset it? Really understanding, and that's what helps you understand the potential for the degree of revenue disruption the organization might be facing. That can be by source. It can also be kind of on a percentage overall. We also want to be looking at the cash runway. So if operations, the monthly operational run rate is $15,000 to $20,000 a month or even more, how many months could we go if revenue ceased coming in? So number of months of cash on hand is an important metric to potentially take a look at. We also want to be looking at the volume of liabilities that the organization is currently carrying, and its liquidity, meaning, could it basically pay back debt? Does it have in some ways some flexibility around the current debt load that the organization is carrying? And so we want to be thinking about, looking at that data together, what are some systemic issues that may have been present before the recent crisis? How significant is the disruption to sources we've traditionally relied on? We are seeing a number of funders
mhm.
pivot their interests and with not substantive amount of notice to potential grantees that have been potentially long-standing. How much time do we have? And this is that cash runway to stabilize and adjust the current sort of expend out in order to extend the runway that we have to continue to operate, and how might liabilities and liquid assets affect the runway or our options. And so really understanding, is there a mortgage? Are there assets that could be if we default on particular payments, what are the sort of consequences of default? It is about really understanding that overall financial picture of the organization with some projections into the future as to what can we expect in the next 6 months and potentially projecting out to the next 18 months. So if you can, you want to be looking at not only this fiscal year, but begin to understand the financial condition for the next fiscal year. And what we want to be doing is having conversations about, is our business model working? Do we need to change our fundamental business model? How many months do we have to explore or build, or potentially, in some cases, how many weeks or months do we need to have to kind of take action to go forward? I think one of the things that is standing out for us in some of our interactions with clients around the country is in many cases that even if there is cash on hand, people recognize that the draw on that cash could be substantive. And so making the choice to potentially dissolve sooner rather than later gives more time to be thoughtful about the deployment of staff, programs, and assets versus running that cash all the way down to zero and really not having a lot of options or things to transfer potentially to another entity. Melissa, is there anything you want to call in on
Absolutely.
this?
Yeah, that you called in the runway length, and that really shapes which strategies kind of fall within that realm of feasibility, right? So how much flexibility or how much urgency you have around the decisions that you have to make. So if you have that longer runway, even if you face some disruption, you can take a look at some of those more proactive strategies because you have an opportunity with that longer runway to be able to come up with new solutions, implement those things, invest in some of the infrastructure that's needed perhaps to do those more proactive strategies. Versus if you have a shorter runway, then you're looking at potentially more of those protective or restructuring strategies because you just don't have as much to work with. And if you're going to protect the mission and the services that are most vital to the people you serve, you may need to make a different set of choices because you just don't have as much to work with. And I like how you were talking about with the degree of revenue disruption. All of those different sources, whether they're donations, grants, government contracts, they all carry different levels of uncertainty. So to be able to go through those and identify, where do we have things that seem to be more stable, secure, versus where do we have some hot spots in terms of the levels of uncertainty, helps you to do more of that scenario thinking around what might we potentially do, what might we need to put in place, and what of those things that we might need to put in place would we decide that we would want to do no matter what because it'll just make us stronger no matter what.
Exactly.
Awesome. So, in that spirit of, what do we have to work with? Um, those financial indicators may narrow or widen what is possible, but they do not determine what leaders choose to do. Boards and executive teams ultimately decide whether they're going to persist, adapt, partner, or conclude this chapter of their work. And so, for this reason, responding to revenue disruption is not only a financial exercise, but it is also a governance and a leadership exercise. It requires organizations to clarify their commitments and their appetite for change, envision how to sustain the mission in whatever form makes the most sense for their future and the future of those folks that they're looking to serve. And that's why this next section of the assessment is just so important. And it's talking about leadership will and alignment. And I'm going to have you share some stories here as well. We've had organizational leaders come into this conversation really with different levels of energy to persist. Anne is fond of saying that an organization could go down to being, just a couple of really committed board members who want to see the mission endure and are willing to roll up their sleeves and do what it takes to make that happen, even if it's at a smaller scale. Other organizations that we've, had conversations with, everyone's tired on the other side of COVID and persistent systemic challenges that the organization has been facing for years. And so this revenue disruption is just yet another stumbling block in their mission progress. And so they really don't have much energy to persist. And so they say, you know what? This just isn't working. And we need to have a conversation about how to transition this work in a responsible way because we just don't see a path forward. So, Anne, do you want to talk a bit about what you're seeing around that energy to persist?
Yeah, and we'll talk about it as well as we continue to go through the conversation today about what is the role of the board and in this
Yeah,
decision making. But the ability to persist is not just one staff member. It
no,
really has to be a joint decision to keep going, whatever keeping going sort of looks like.
yeah,
And again, I think we have to recognize that this idea of choice making in this moment, even if you were to choose to solution, it's not a fast choice.
no.
All of these choices require the involvement of boards, the involvement of staff to move forward. And so, even in challenging
Hmm.
circumstances, we need some subset of a board to be willing to persist through the next steps. And those steps are either steps around renewal, retrenchment, or closure. But in fact, we do need board members to stick with these things. And so, this
Yeah.
idea of persistence is really critical in terms of, again, as the stress increases, um, many volunteers may step off. I talk a lot about
Hmm.
sometimes that boards are like buses. And when it gets really dark, people put up cardboard on the bus. They're like, we cannot leave until we have a path forward. In a lot of ways, like we have to recognize that volunteer leadership and involvement in these decisions is critical. And again,
Absolutely.
being reflective about where your board is today and would they be willing to persist if things got
Hmm.
hard is a really important conversation and assessment to be doing with your volunteer leadership.
Absolutely. And having that conversation right up front is so important
Mhm.
because, it's a hard conversation to have, but it really helps create either that shared commitment to roll up your sleeves and get creative and figure out what we're going to do, or a shared admission that we need to have a different kind of conversation. And, neither of those are the wrong answer, but it's so important to be able to just name the thing and make sure that we're kind of in agreement in terms of that headspace that all the leaders are in and whether there's alignment there between those sets of leaders.
Absolutely.
And if you've got the board who says, and the staff leadership team who says, yes, we want to persist. Let's do this. We're going to take the hill. What is the appetite for innovation or change? This moment that organizations find themselves in means that business as usual is not going to continue to be the recipe for success. And so we have to be able to have those conversations around what could we do differently? How do we need to change in order to evolve our business model or meet this moment differently, fund it differently? And then what kind of entrepreneurial mindsets and capacities do folks have to actually be able to do that kind of thinking and execute on that kind of thinking? And sometimes, there needs to be a recognition. We often have this conversation when it comes to social enterprise that the folks that are sitting around the table may have great intentions and some great ideas, but do we perhaps also need to bring other folks into the conversation in order to make sure that we have those mindsets and capacities to do the different kind of work that we're looking to do in this moment in time? And then the other part of what do we have to work with? So we have our people and their willingness to persist and their great mindsets they're going to bring to this. But also, let's take a look at our mission assets, as I call them. These are those non-financial assets necessarily that are really core to the value of your organization. So your program uniqueness and its value to the community. Do you offer something that would really be detrimental for the community to lose because you are uniquely doing it either in total or the way you do it is uniquely different? What do you have in terms of intellectual property, staff expertise, great infrastructure? Like you've got a great case management program or a great QA system. What is it that you have that is valuable to your organization and potentially to other organizations? And having those clear conversations around what must be protected versus what maybe we could let go of. And we'll talk more about retrenchment later on, but it kind of starts this conversation around what is most core to our organization's mission and its reason for being, and what are some other things that we do that are nice and they have value, but if we've got to cut, maybe those things that we look at first. And then relationships are, of course, another critically vital tool, especially as we think about an organization's ability to pivot and respond. So, what are those relationships that you have with your funders and major donors who may be able to help you in a time of revenue disruption? What partners and champions do you already have that may be able to mobilize quickly and help you, garner support, if you need to advocate for the funding that you need? And what referral networks do you have when you think about, programs that either could really use a boost of enrollment through a referral network or maybe need to be offloaded through a referral network? What are those relationships that are going to help you implement decisions and pursue some of the funding that you may need or the support that you may need in order to sustain your work?
And the other asset, Melissa, which may be obvious on this slide, but isn't actually called out maybe as specifically as it perhaps could be, which is our relationships with community,
Yeah.
the relationships with the clients we serve, the uniqueness of the relationship between staff and clients. One of the things that we recognize as an organization pivots or a program is lost is those relationships are impacted. And so, being thoughtful about who do we have relationships with, and I think we call it out in the referral networks piece, but there are like critical partners that you partner with to make your work come
Mhm.
to fruition, also an asset of the organization. And so I just really want to call that again, I think it's centered in kind of mission and in relationships, but some of the most
Yep.
important relationships that an organization has is that with the community and the clients that it serves.
Absolutely. Thanks for calling that in. So,
And so,
Anne, we're moving
yeah.
into how to decide.
How to decide? I mean, so part of this stock taking, which I think we do around the financial piece, the mission piece, the relational piece, is really understanding what are the pieces and parts in some ways that represent the value of our organization as we bring mission to fruition. If we are experiencing revenue disruption, the key is to choose a path. I will definitively say that some of the organizations that we've observed through COVID, through this moment, there is a stuckness that happens. There's a paralysis that can occur. There can be a not choosing, which ultimately is a choice in and of itself. And so what we want organizations to do is acknowledge the moment, do this
Hmm.
stock taking, and then in so many ways decide how they are going to respond. It is an intentional choice. I was in a board meeting over the weekend, with a board that was beginning to consider strategic partnerships, and one of the things that stands out for me is this recognition of we could respond to what happens in the environment, or we could choose what happens next. And so we
Hmm.
really just want to call in this idea that once organizations really understand their financial position, they understand the assets they have to work with, you are much better positioned to determine how to proceed, to decide about what your response is going to be to the current disruption and or disruption that could happen in the future. What becomes clear at this stage is we recognize that there is not one single correct response. There is not the right thing to do
Hmm.
here. There is not one answer. Instead, based on an organization's context, there's a range of strategic options that really correspond to a set of different circumstances. And we want to recognize, and Melissa, we can go to the next slide, that in determining how we proceed, there are really decisions and filters that we can bring to that decision-making process. So once we've understood our financials, our mission, assets, our relationships, we're engaging our board and staff in a series of discussions. How do we consider various options in the context of what can protect our clients and our commitments to equity? Who benefits from our choices and who may lose, or in some ways be negatively impacted by the choices we may be forced to make? Thinking about our mission. Does this preserve or advance our core purpose? Recognizing, and I think Melissa and I really appreciate the work out of Janeway Skillern and with Network Mindset, which is there is protecting the mission and then there is protecting the organization. Can we
Yeah.
make choices that advance mission, recognizing that we may need to prioritize mission over entity? How
Hmm.
much cash runway do we actually have to make choices? Is this option feasible within our runway? Reversibility. There are some decisions we could make that are very difficult to unwind. If we think the conditions are going to change, can we make a choice where unwinding some of our choices is actually easier than others? And existentially, we also want to make sure we're calling in this idea of risk and compliance. We do recognize that some strategic choices related to revenue disruption may have an impact on staffing. You may be forced to do layoffs. Recognizing that there's HR, in so many ways, legal requirements to follow as you go through that process. Do we have other legal or funder constraints that our choices
Yeah.
should be informed by? And again, the sort of set of these decision-making filters, and again, prompts to work through with leaders, begins to help us see the continuum of options that really are available to us.
Awesome. So, as far as that continuum of options go, here we are. So I'm just going to walk through kind of a high level overview of what this model is really starting to lay out. So, all the way on the left-hand side, organizations operating from a position of relative strength, so those with stable finances, strong programs, aligned leadership, they're often able to take a proactive approach. So, in this case, disruption can become an opportunity to rethink that business model, think through new services, earned revenue strategies, or partnerships that expand impact. So rather than simply protecting what exists, these organizations can redeploy their assets in new ways to sustain the mission over time. Other organizations find themselves in a position where their programming remains strong, their leaders are committed, but that revenue base needs recalibration or reinforcement. This is where we saw those cases where we're saying, yep, maybe our business model really needs some work here to make it more sustainable. So here, the focus typically shifts to strengthening the funding engine through advocacy, new grant opportunities, intensified fundraising, and that's like really where you're leaning into those relationships. As conditions become more uncertain, some organizations recognize that they can't continue operating at their current scale. So, in these cases, retrenchment, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a bit, can be the most responsible path forward. So, it involves making thoughtful decisions about which programs to sustain and which to step away from, so that the organization can shrink while continuing to deliver its most essential work. So it's really having that conversation about what is most important to protect, even if we have to get rid of some other things for a period of time. Sometimes the strategy is enough to stabilize the organization, which can then build back more sustainably over time. Other times, leadership reaches a different conclusion. So, moving more towards the right-hand side of the chart over here, they may decide that continuing alone is not in the best interest or the best way to protect the work that they care the most about. And so in these cases, strategic consolidations like parent subsidiary arrangements, mergers, asset transfers can become really important tools. So the goal is not simply organizational survival, as Anne was calling in about Janeway Skillern's work, but it's really about the preservation of mission, vital services, and expertise within a structure that can sustain them. And then at the very far end of the continuum, when we look at wind down or dissolutions, some organizations just really determine that the environment no longer supports their continued operation. This is especially in the case where we've got that really short runway. And in these cases, a thoughtful wind down or dissolution can ensure staff, programs, and clients transition responsibly and that the mission impact can continue in some other form.
And I
So we're going to go through and take a look at these options. But before we do, Anne, do you have anything to kind of add to that overview of the range of options?
Yeah, I mean, I think the understanding that this is a continuum, and what you see
Yeah.
really across the top is this range from proactive to protective to responsible restructuring, in terms of recognizing that the choices are different based on the
Hmm.
results of that financial and sort of mission and relational asset assessment. Because along the bottom, you see really the results of that assessment being a strong position, precarious position, and weak position. And one of
Yeah.
the things that Melissa and I talked a bit about prior to today's call is that idea of position is
Yeah.
not just financial. It
Hmm.
really is the Venn diagram of financial position, programmatic position, leadership position, because you, in
Yeah.
fact, can have a cash runway. You could have a reasonably decent programming. But if you have a board that is really exhausted about reinventing the business model, you are
Hmm.
in a precarious or weak position. You really need
Yes.
the Venn diagram of all three sort of components working to be considered in a strong position. And so we really are
Yeah.
seeing this role of the board in this work as a really critical component of the ability to implement proactive strategies versus protective strategies or
Yeah.
responsible restructuring. And I really appreciate, Melissa and I often go back and forth offline about these issues. This
Yep.
idea of position really not just being the finances, because the reality is you could have financial assets and still find yourself in a precarious or weak position.
Absolutely. So, Anne, why
Yeah.
don't we start taking a look at that proactive end of things when you're in
Yeah.
this stronger position and the kind of conversation we can have around business model innovation?
Yeah, and I really think as we work around the country and work with clients for whom, they have had a sustainable business model historically, there are assets and capital available to deploy to really be thinking about a response. This is where we really see business model innovation. Organizations are in good shape to be thinking about, how can we take a look at our fee for service work, consider adjustments to program delivery contracts? Could we offer invest in professional services, offering professional services to other entities, thinking about training
Hmm.
and consulting. This is really about earned revenue and thinking about how do we actually leverage our existing assets to improve our revenue position and advance our mission. We have organizations that are thinking about their own intellectual property. Can we license program models? Can we think about certification, create educational materials that might be available? So organizations that are in a much stronger position can think about earned revenue in terms of field impact, being a peer leader in their ecosystem, really thinking about how to monetize their assets, whether that be physical space, sharing equipment, offering venue services. Increasingly, we are certainly seeing event management perkle up as a potential earned revenue and social enterprise for some of the clients we're working with. But the recognition, in this kind of space is that you are in a strong position. And in many ways, you can really be thinking about strategies that help you continue to strengthen that revenue position.
Absolutely.
In addition to that, when we're in a strong position, we talk a little bit about how might a strategic alliance help or amplify your impact. I do think there's a recognition for stronger entities that are in that strong position that they're quote unquote going to get a call in the next 12 to
Hmm.
18 months. And so we're really encouraging organizations that find themselves in that place to be thinking about an intentional partnership strategy. So what are the types of organizations that they would like to partner with, whether it's expanding their reach by growing market share or geography, expanding their continuum of services with complementary or ancillary services to the same that would be helpful to the same clients and families they may be serving already, thinking about new and innovative combinations of programs and services, or the opportunity to acquire new talent and mindsets into their organizations. It's not about just being interested in what comes across the threshold, but being really thoughtful and intentional about how partnership,
Yeah.
again, can continue to strengthen that sustainable business model.
And when you look at all of those really positive, expansive reasons for going into a strategic alliance, like Anne said, even if you haven't thought about strategic alliance in terms of, this is something that's going to be really vital for us to do to sustain our organization, you can have this conversation about what could it potentially unlock for us? And then be ready and clear about what those really great cases for alliance are so that, like Anne said, if you get the phone call, you've already had this conversation as an organization about what would be a right fit conversation. And so you would be clear and able to say, like, yes, actually, that is really strategically aligned with what we want to do. Or no, you know what? I really appreciate that, but that's not actually something that is really going to advance our work. So being proactive about that is just, I think, an important strategy for organizations of any situation to consider right now.
Absolutely. And the last piece is when we think about an organization that, again, to Melissa's point, is that sort of second phase as we walk kind of across the continuum. This idea of an organization that has committed leadership, strong programming, but that revenue disruption piece is an issue. This is where we're actually doing that fund development recalibration. This is thinking about how can we protect or change the funding mix. And so it may be advocating either as an individual entity or as part of a coalition, association, or through alliances to protect either government funding or to secure, candidly, additional private funding. We are seeing private funders be more interested in sort of what I would call kind of larger play investments that have multiplayer opportunities. And so, again, this idea of advocacy and coming together to protect government funding or intensify fundraising appeals to individuals or major donors, again, as an individual entity or in partnership with others. Leaning in so many ways to address place philanthropy, finding those funders that are really interested in investing and scaling in what is working, either within your geography or nationally, and looking and scanning for shifts in funder priorities. Increasingly, there is, I think, more visibility to the grant making activity across the country. And so, in so many ways, you might be a local provider, but have the opportunity to tap national funding if it's something that you think there are national funders that would be interested in scaling or protecting or expanding that work nationally.
Awesome. Moving on to those more protective strategies, this is where we get to that conversation around retrenchment and how can you shrink in order to stabilize the organization and then potentially over time really grow back strategically in perhaps even a more sustainable and strong way. So there's a couple of different ways that you can think about retrenchment. One is you're going to keep doing everything that you do, but you're just doing less of it. So you're just shrinking the organization to be doing the same thing, but on a smaller scale. The other way is to give yourself permission to think about what are the programs that are most adaptive or innovative, the most essential to the folks that you serve, and that frankly are most likely to survive the funders' cuts. And to be choiceful around what are those things that we need to protect that are most vital to our mission and the people that we serve, and what are some non-essential programs that we could potentially let go of responsibly. So are there other organizations in our space that the thing that is, valuable and nice for us to do is actually what's core and essential to their work. And so we can responsibly let go of this piece of our programming equation because we know that those clients that we serve can get programs from this other organization down the street. And so you're giving yourself permission to really just focus in on those things that are most essential to your mission and the folks that you serve and get smaller for a period of time so that you can stabilize and potentially then grow back in a more sustainable way.
Yeah, and I'll just add, Melissa, there before we sort of step into the next sort of tranche in some ways, is this recognition that there's a connection between retrenchment and the next sort of discussion, which is going to be about strategic consolidation. In some cases, this shrinking activity can include moving one or two programs, but actually
Hmm.
retaining a core, to your point. And so let's kind of shift over to the kind of next
Yeah.
set of options, which are really about strategic consolidation. This idea of could we advance our mission more effectively by partnering with others? And again, this is that mindset of how do I hold mission ahead of entity and begin to think about how to get stronger together rather than continuing alone. And so we do a lot of work around strategic consolidation and partnership right now. We're doing a lot of training and holding space for learning on this issue. We are in some ways, and again, it's been part of our history as a practice, but this idea that in many cases, the social sector is less familiar with using a lot of legal structures that are typically used in the corporate structure to advance mission. And so we want to recognize that there's many forms and ways of doing this, whether it's program partnerships or joint ventures, managed contract networks, and this is where one entity might be providing management services to another, shared infrastructure agreements, parent subsidiary relationships, mergers, asset transfers. It's a little bit like, oh my, like there's all of these things. But we want to recognize that these are all structural choices to advance a rationale for combination. And so there are a lot of reasons why you may consider these options, like containing or sharing costs, building new revenue opportunities, building a more sustainable program and revenue mix. Sometimes we see partnerships about organizations that might primarily have third-party building with an organization that is primarily grant funding. It's this idea of
Yes.
what's the portfolio of revenue that can be combined to really support mission and advance impact. We can protect programs and staff in these ways, and we can transfer unsustainable but important programs from one entity to another. And so again, strategic kind of is kind of its own deep dive, but I think in a lot of ways for organizations and the critical part for the strategic alliance and consolidation conversation is about really working with a partner to come to consensus around what's the rationale for combination
Yes.
and ultimately choosing a structure that brings that rationale to fruition.
Absolutely. And that's where, again, that clarity of self helps you get clear about what the reason would be, what the ask actually is, and then you can figure out the form from there. There's a lot of different options and how to structure these arrangements.
And so just want to also name that, when we are thinking about proactively preparing for strategic consolidation, we can spend time thinking, as we said in some of the previous said, why would we do this? Who are we looking for? What of our current partners are potentially mission aligned and would be open to a conversation about partnership? Can we actually create a conversation where we could explore a combined value proposition? How we become stronger together? If we really do need to transfer programming, who might be interested or benefit from that transfer? And primarily, what due diligence and information would we need to sort of supply to leadership to feel comfortable with a choice around strategic consolidation? And some of these kind of questions hold true for if you're considering a strategic alliance from a strong position or considering a strategic alliance from a weaker or more precarious position.
Absolutely.
And then we
And
have
then,
the
yeah, go
solution.
ahead.
Yeah. And we do want to recognize that, if we have this, we do this work, and the real piece around dissolution is persistence. In so many ways, if we have gotten to this place of assessment and really recognize that we shouldn't go on in this form, that this form perhaps has run its course, and that if this work is going to continue, it should continue in another way. And so in this case, we would really come to a conclusion to sunset or close responsibly, wind down operations, and dissolve the entity. This includes both a vote to dissolve and approving a plan of dissolution. In some cases, notification of a state level attorney general is needed, but the key is here to address liabilities, distribute remaining assets to other nonprofits, which is usually dictated by the bylaws, ensure compliance with state and federal laws and filing requirements, contracts, and donor restrictions. There's also issues here to monitor around any pension or 401ks. And there's other components that really do need sort of legal compliance oversight if this is the path that you end up choosing. And in addition to that, there needs to be some thoughtfulness around managing the internal and external communications with care. This is a very difficult decision to make, and we often can see
Mhm.
whether it's a volunteer or staff member, um, in some ways taking a message and running with it, perhaps with not enough intention, which can
Yeah,
actually erode relationships even further.
absolutely. You know, well, actually, yeah, go ahead, Anne, around the don't
Yeah,
wait too long message, and then I'll
yeah,
talk more about that
two,
messaging.
two messaging, on the
Yeah,
strategic consolidation and wind down. I mean, people have to understand these things don't happen quickly, right? And so
yes.
you do still need to have some level of operating entity and cash runway to do this body of work. And in the case of dissolution, you need to have a few board members that are willing to stay with this thing until it's fully dissolved, which can take in some cases anywhere from 3 months to a year, to really kind of tie up all of the loose ends. And so our message across the entire framework is don't wait too long. Don't wait
Yes.
too long to begin to have these conversations. If you follow me on LinkedIn, I had an entire rant about this a few weeks ago because the thing that we're seeing is that boards are not paying attention. Staff are holding space for very difficult observations about financial predictions and risk. They're working with boards. They're saying, hey, things don't look good as we're looking ahead. And in some cases, boards are kind of tucking their heads in the sand and saying, well, just keep going. It'll come through. It always does. It doesn't sometimes.
Yeah.
And then we can't make payroll and we're laying off 6 staff. And so we really have a call to leadership in the sector right now, which is do not wait too long to begin to do this assessment, to engage your board, who are the primary decision makers, around setting this course. We've got to engage them, and we've got to engage them now.
Absolutely. And, thank you for calling in that this applies across the entire continuum. So, yes, of
Mhm.
course, we think about the polar bear who's balancing on the little chunk of ice, but it also pertains to folks who are on a larger iceberg and perhaps not looking ahead, seeing what's happening at the edges of their organization, understanding what's coming down the road, and having those proactive conversations around how do we need to be proactive and strengthen what we have to make sure that we stay nice and solid, or how do we start having these other kinds of conversations about partnership or other models that we might, other responses that we might take if things go a different way, if something that we're a little bit worried about comes to fruition. So
Yeah.
yes, no matter kind of what position you're in, don't wait too long, don't avoid the conversation, really be proactive about it.
And we have to recognize that none of the paths represents failure. If we're
Yes.
holding mission and community
Yep.
central to our decision making, we are not failing. We are
Yes.
choosing, and it's different. And what we want to sort of make sure that leaders are hearing from us is the risk is avoiding hard choices until the options disappear. We want you to
Exactly.
make the choices while you still have viable options to consider to protect your staff, your mission, and your programs.
Absolutely. And that's what this slide here is really trying to break down is that no matter what path, move forward with intentionality. So think about those implementation considerations. So you've picked a path. What are the potential barriers? What are the resources that are needed, whether that's financial, relational, infrastructure, to execute the path forward that you're looking to take? And what other information do you need? Do you need to do more listening? Do you need to do some more field research or financial scenario planning or situational scenario planning? What is it that you need to really understand in order to move forward with that real intentionality? And then, Anne mentioned when we were back on the dissolution slide around kind of change management and messaging and how we really think about the implications of these choices on the folks that are really important to our organizations. So taking that time to map who is affected and how, from the staff to the clients to board members, really just under to your funders, really understanding those different circles of impact and understanding how folks are going to be affected by the choice. And then mapping out who needs to know what by when, who should deliver that message. And then really think about that core messaging, the tone, how they're going to receive that message, who the messenger is going to be, and just make sure you're communicating again with a lot of intentionality and care so that in the process of making these really difficult decisions and doing your very best to try to secure vital mission work and service work, that you're not inadvertently, missing the mark and eroding trust by not being thoughtful about taking these hard choices that you've made and articulating them in a way that other folks are really going to understand the process you've been through and what they should expect.
And so, just want to reinforce sort of a key message of today's conversation, which is that responding to revenue disruption is very much a leadership and governance exercise. This is not just about math, this is about people. And so I want to go to the next slide and really kind of drive home this idea of the role of the board. Again, your board of directors is the only group of people who can make substantive decisions related to your legal structure going forward. And so if that is a partnership or it is dissolution or it is spinning off a subsidiary to do a for-profit revenue enterprise, like your board is a critical partner in the ability to make those decisions. It is part of their fiduciary responsibility. And so what does that mean? It means if your board is not familiar with your current financial position, start there. Your board has to be strong financial stewards. They have to understand your business model. They have to understand where the revenue come from and what's their role in supporting revenue generation. We need to create the space to listen. Board members have to really, when a board or hears a CEO or executive director saying, I'm concerned about the future, that is not to be discounted. We have to create the space within the context of board meetings to have generative discussions. What are we seeing in the environment? What might we expect? What are some of the strategic questions that people are thinking about that we haven't dedicated the time really to explore together as a group? We want to make sure that we avoid overly optimistic positions. It'll come through. It'll be fine. It always has. And or panic, which is the sky is falling and we need to sort of drive change and drive fear into the hearts of board members and staff because this is
Yeah.
all coming to a crashing halt. Neither position results in good decision making. And so we really do have to ensure alignment around how much risk are we experiencing? What are our core values? What are our commitments to each other, our commitments to our community? How do we as a board oversee and approve any changes to the corporate structure? What's the role of the board in
Mhm.
understanding the ecosystem and the environment? Having spent time recently with boards who are interested in strategic alliances, it is very hard to stay in a place of abundance mindset right now. When we are in a
Mhm.
constrained, resource constrained environment, the board's focus is on risk, impact, taking on distressed assets, and candidly, a real orientation towards risk aversion. When in fact, this moment of disruption needs us to lean into a place of abundance, which is what's possible for our work, for our community, and to advance our mission. And there is a tension there between that fiduciary responsibility and building something that no one can see yet. And that's the
Mhm.
space that we have to hold, which is where can we recognize the role of the board in understanding the fiduciary risk an organization might be taking on and allow for the possibility of building things that in some ways we just can't see yet. And we haven't built yet, and we haven't created them yet. And so we want to make sure that our board has a unified front and talk track, no matter what the set of choices are that we're considering. We want to make sure that the board has time to reflect in board meetings and spaces and containers in so many ways to do this good work together. And so I think if we have a call to action right now, it's make sure your board can be a confident decision maker and partner to you as a staff or CEO. And if you're a board member listening, really ask yourself, am I leaning in right now when my organization and mission really needs me to?
Yeah. Which really tees up beautifully these kind of key takeaways that we want to leave you with. So if we think about, the conversation that we've had with you over the last hour, it's about starting with clarity, not urgency, really taking that time to take stock of your financial, your leadership position, your mission assets, and really look at what it is you have to work with. And again, that those financial realities shape choices, but they do not fully dictate them. There is a lot more that comes into play here. So really make that space to have those conversations about whether you're going to persist, adapt, partner, or conclude this chapter of your work. They are sometimes emotional conversations. So give them the space that they need for you all to really get aligned on those things and move forward with some shared understanding and clarity about what is really in best service to your mission and to the community that you serve. To kind of help you more with that assessment point, all of these, when you get the PDF, you'll be able to click on these links. We have some related articles and toolkits on our website that can help you with doing some more assessing your situation and deciding what to do. So there's tools in that Meeting the Moment with Clarity toolkit that will help you look at your financial position, your programmatic position, those kinds of things. We have some resources around retrenchment and around preparing to partner that could be really good ways for you to structure some assessing for yourself and some conversations within your organization.
And I think for me, this is the call to action as leaders and board members, which is do not wait too long to have these conversations. Do not wait too long to learn together. That is where this work starts, is it starts from that place of curiosity and learning. Can we learn about where we are so that we can ultimately choose an intentional path forward as we navigate this really difficult environment? We want to make sure organizations are prepared. We do think that there will be contraction in the sector. It's not if you get a phone call to potentially partner with an organization, it's just when you get a phone call. So, as much as you can, if you're in an organization that is in a stable position, then you're considering some of those proactive strategies. It's how can we be clear about what is the role of strategic alliance and partnership and continuing to support our work and continue to use the framework to prompt staff leadership and board retreats. Have conversations about scenario planning or contingency planning. I think the tool helps people acknowledge that there's
Mhm.
more to your path forward than just your financial
Yeah.
position. It really is about the set of leaders and human beings that are leading your entity every day today, and their willingness to keep going through these challenging times. And so we just really want to call out and call in the incredible leadership across the sector that it continues to
Hmm.
navigate these really challenging times, and how our call to action is really about how can boards and staff really come together around their intentional path forward as organizations. And we're really grateful to anyone who's sort of listening in or with us today live on the call to laying into these questions about what does shared leadership look like in really uncertain times. So grateful for the time together today.
Absolutely. And with that, we're going to stop the recording so that we can have a conversation with all of you about what it is that you're experiencing as an organization and what kind of conversations you would like to have within your organizations. So with that, I'm going to stop share and
Thanks so
end the
much.
recording.